In the 18th century, a woman was born whose life would be filled with pain, sorrow, and frustration. Her story is the kind that makes you want to pull your hair out in anguish. When a person endures such unbearable suffering in life, death can sometimes be seen as a release. But for her, not even death brought peace. Her lifeless body was exploited for nearly a century. Her crime, being born with unusually large hip and sexual organ. Today I bring you the story of Sarah Baartman, a tragic tale of exploitation and pain. In 1789, along the serene Gamtoos River Valley in South Africa, a girl named Sarah, or Sarah Baartman, was born. She was a member of the Griqua tribe, believed to be one of the earliest indigenous peoples of South Africa. When Sarah was just 2 years old, her world began to unravel. First, she lost her mother. Soon after, her father, a cattle herder, was killed during the colonial battles between the British and Dutch, though the exact date of his death remains a mystery. Sarah was left an orphan in a world marked by violence and loss. By the time she was 14 or 15, she found a brief moment of happiness. She married a drummer from her tribe, and they soon welcomed a child. But life had other plans. Their baby passed away shortly after birth, leaving the young couple heartbroken. As they struggled to heal from this devastating loss, yet another tragedy struck. At just 16, Sarah lost her husband. He fell victim to the Dutch colonists, though the reasons remain unknown. By this point, Sarah had endured more grief than many face in a lifetime. Orphaned as a child, she lost her baby and husband while still in her teens. Alone and vulnerable, she was taken in by a slave trader named Willem Caesar, who forced her to work as a slave on a farm in Cape Town. While Sarah worked as a slave on the farm, as one might expect, she was not treated kindly. But considering the depths of the pain she had already endured, it's hard to say how much she cared anymore. Then one day, a man named William Dunlop, a doctor and soldier, visited Caesar's farm. It was here that he first noticed Sarah. Sarah had exceptionally wide and prominent hips, and a disproportionately large, noticeable sexual organ. Considering the typical clothing of enslaved women at the time, loose and designed to obscure their body shapes, it's understandable that Dunlop might have noticed her hips, but how he could have known about her other physical features remains unclear. Regardless, William Dunlop saw an opportunity in Sarah. He believed that if he took her to London and put her on display, she would captivate the curiosity of the European public. Dunlop made various promises to Sarah, telling her she would be part of a medical research project and that she had the chance to become rich and famous. In her desperation for a better life, Sarah fell for his lies. Trusting the promises made to her, Sarah set off with Dunlop on the long journey to London. Little did she know, an agreement had already been made between, even though I don't want to call it that way, her owner Caesar, and Dr. Dunlop. Even Sarah, unable to read or write, was forced to sign it. Since slavery had technically been abolished in London, the contract cleverly stated that she would serve as a domestic worker, be exhibited for entertainment, and after 5 years, return home with the money she had earned. At least, that's what she was led to believe, but Sarah could never have predicted the horrors that awaited her. The promises were nothing but empty words. She would not find freedom, nor would she return home. Instead, she would remain a slave for the rest of her life, and even after death. At the age of 21, Sarah was brought to London. In the beginning, as Dunlop had promised, she was examined by doctors and researchers of the time. However, within a month, she found herself on display in Piccadilly, exposed to the crowd's insults, harassment, and perverse fascination. Her body, which captivated the Europeans, is now believed to have been a result of steatopygia, a condition common in her tribe. It was considered a natural trait in her culture, where many women had larger hips and sexual organs than the norm. But Sarah's were far more exaggerated, which drew even more attention. She was forced into tight-fitting clothing that accentuated her figure, painted with strange makeup and adorned with oversized jewelry. Often, she was made to dance, paraded as a spectacle. Other times, they didn't bother dressing her at all, leaving her nearly naked, subjected to taunts and abuse. This continued for 4 long years, during which Sarah understandably began to mistreat herself. She turned to alcohol, perhaps hoping it would help her cope with the immense weight of. As the shows continued, the European public, known for giving nicknames, coined one for Sarah too, the Hottentot Venus. The term Hottentot was the name Europeans used for Sarah's tribe, and Venus, the goddess of love and lust, was added due to the size of her hips and the prominence of her sexual organs. Some compassionate Europeans found Sarah's treatment inhuman and suspected she was being held against her will, so they filed complaints. The case went to court, where Sarah's captors produced the contract she had signed. Sarah herself testified that she wasn't being held against her will. How freely she gave that testimony, though, is anyone's guess. From 1810 to 1814, Sarah was exhibited in various museums and circuses across London. When her so-called owners had apparently made enough profit, they sold her in 1814 to a man who ran wild animal shows in Paris. he continued to exploit Sarah in the same way, putting her on display for profit. But in Paris, the situation took an even more degrading turn. Her new owner allowed not only viewing, but also touching, selling Sarah's body to men for their pleasure. She was displayed in a cage next to a rhinoceros, performing tricks to amuse the paying public. I don't know how accurate it is to call it fortunately, but fortunately, Sarah died a year later in 1815 at the age of 26, reportedly due to alcohol and stress. Unfortunately, the disgraceful treatment didn't stop with her death. What you're about to hear might be a bit disturbing, so consider this a warning. But the horrors didn't end with Sarah's death. In fact, what happened next is even more disturbing. Just one day after she passed away, Sarah's body was taken by Napoleon's surgeon, Georges Cuvier, for examination. He dissected her, removing and studying her brain and sexual organs. Her body parts were later sent to the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, National Museum of Natural History. Years later, these remains were transferred to the Musée de l'Homme, Museum of Man, where they were put on display. As if profiting from her living body wasn't enough, Sarah's lifeless remains continued to suffer. European scientists and writers produced articles about her body, using her as a symbol to assert the supposed superiority and normality of the European race, further fueling their twisted fantasies. Thankfully, there was eventually a call to return Sarah's remains to her homeland, but the matter was quickly brushed aside and nothing was done. In the early 1950 years, Sarah's tribe finally remembered her and requested the return of her body from France. But France refused, declaring that all artifacts displayed in French museums belonged to France. Years later, when Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa after the 1994 elections, he raised the issue with the French president during a visit to South Africa. But even then, the matter wasn't resolved, and the issue was once again closed. Determined, Sarah's tribe continued to appeal to their own government for help in reclaiming her remains. They even organized protests, convincing the Minister of Culture to take action. In 2000, the Minister of Culture formally submitted a request to France for Sarah's remains to be returned. But once again, the answer was no. I'm sure, like me, you're feeling frustrated, thinking, how could this still be happening? But was Sarah's body ever returned? Yes, it was. And how? Through a poem. Diana Ferris, a writer from the same land as Sarah, was the one who changed everything. In 1998, while studying in Utrecht, Netherlands, Diana wrote a poem about Sarah Baartman. She was reflecting on Sarah's tragic life while researching sexuality in the colonies. What many respected politicians couldn't achieve, Diana Ferris accomplished with her poem. The poem caught the attention of French Senator Nicolas About, who came across it online. Moved by the words, he contacted Ferris, conducted research on the matter, and read the poem aloud in the French Senate. They want to record her as a monster, but where is the real monstrosity in all this? He asked, calling for Baartman's return to South Africa. Finally, in January 2002, the French Senate approved the request. By April, Saartjie Baartman's skeleton and her organs, preserved in jars, were handed over to South African officials in a ceremony held in Paris. Sarah, who had become a national symbol of a humiliated and exploited people, was finally home. All thanks to the power of a poem.